Dear brothers and sisters, it's a great pleasure to see you tonight. Today is very special presentation from Germany about a saint who lived in Germany but had the strong connections with Ireland. And I would like to ask Valentina to introduce Cornelia, because you know her better, to our guests.
Thank you, Father Michael. So it's a pleasure to have Cornelia here tonight with us. And thank you very much, Cornelia, for coming, for finding time between your busy life and commitments and engagements. And Cornelia, I would like to say a few words about Cornelia at the beginning. And I would like to say that Cornelia does a lot of work and she is one of the prominent leaders in disseminating information about the Orthodoxy in German-speaking countries. So she runs conferences, she organizes talks, she is involved in publishing and translation and different projects involving videos and interviews with priests, with people. And this is only few examples of what Cornelia does. Cornelia is not a professional theologian. She is a philosopher. She was a Protestant long time ago, and she converted to Orthodoxy. And she is philosopher who focus on bioethics. So this is another hat which Cornelia wears. So she is a very prominent researcher and very prominent leader in Orthodoxy, but also she does a lot of work in bioethics at the same time. And she became Orthodox as a result of some risky prayers. She ventured, and she has been passionate about when she was hunting relics of saints whenever she travels around the Europe and whenever she presents at different conferences around Europe. And by experiencing the power of holiness in those relics, she became interested in saints alive in them. So this is a very brief introduction, and today Cornelia will talk about one of her favorite saints, Saint Lioba. Okay, thank you very much, Cornelia.
Thank you, Valentina. First of all, I don't know whether you have already had a series of saints presented in your group, but I just want to say a few words. Why are we called to study the lives of the saints? And of course, the most complete answer is offered by St. Justin of Cellia's introduction to his Lives of the Saints. And he writes, and I'll just cite a short passage. If you wish, the lives of the saints are a sort of Orthodox encyclopedia. In them can be found everything which is necessary for the soul, which hungers and thirsts for eternal righteousness and eternal truth in this life, and which hungers and thirsts for divine immortality and eternal life. If faith is what you need, there you will find it in abundance. And you will feed your soul with food which will never make it hungry. If you need love, truth, righteousness, hope, meekness, humility, repentance, prayer, or whatever virtue or podvik in them, the lives of the saints, you will find a countless number of holy teachers for every podvik, and will obtain grace-filled help for every virtue. Of course, St. Justin's text is much longer and much more beautiful. I would much rather read him but talk by myself. But let's move to two important aspects. The saints are models for us to emulate, but they also offer help for those who ask for it. To a very worldly person like me, both these functions have been a bit difficult to access. as to saints as role models. Their vitae have pretty much rubbed away every trace of worldly remnants. They feed us with miracles which inspire, so it seems to me, more awe than willingness for fellowship. Now, to be sure, the image these vitae present is like an icon. It invites us for prayer, asking for the support of the saints in our own weak attempts to follow Christ. Still, the depicted perfection in those lives can be discouraging, dragged down by daily cares. We are anyway severely challenged with the task of remembering our divine calling. At least for me, it is quite tempting to try just getting by without judging, disregarding, and grumbling at the wishes of those dear neighbors around me whom I'm called to enveloped in the divine love I myself am supposed to be filled with. Good Lord, I already call it a good day when I manage to keep my mouth shut 70% of the time I should have. So most of the time, the saints remain a little distant to me. And yet, as Saint Sophronia of Essex has said, our readiness to really live with the saints and to ask for their intercession and protection is indispensable for our life as Christians. And that gets me to the second function of the saints that they can have in our lives. But in order to prayerfully ask for their support, we must, so it seems to me already, have some kind of personal relationship with them. We must already feel ready to take them along on our journey through life. Now, for an ex-Protestant who was never raised with saints, nor even with the Theotokos, this is challenging. Now, thank God we are never alone. Even the smallest motion in the right direction will be answered by some small gift of divine grace. For me, that gift, as Valentina already said, has been the encounter with relics. I first was exposed to their veneration by the brothers of the St. Spiridon Skeet in Galnau, where I was baptized and where the abbot was my spiritual father, Father Vasily. After the training I received during various little pilgrimages in the neighborhood of the Skeet, I could continue on my own. Valentina already talked about it. Whenever I travel or traveled, I don't do it anymore so much, I researched beforehand where are relics and how can I get them, and I, of course, called priests and secretaries of churches and made sure I get access and so on. And I must say, for me, being able to visit relics and to venerate them, for me, it's most helpful if I do it all by myself, if there's nobody around except maybe a fellow pilgrim friend, because in the silence of their presence, I really, and that happens even in museums, in glass containers, I can really feel their presence. And that gives me a completely different access. And so I've often been to St. Lioba's relics with various visitors to the Hermitage, and it's each time a wonderful experience to be with her. Now, let's start with Lioba. What we know about her, all information. Am I talking too fast or too slow or anything?
No, all is good. Thank you.
Okay.
All is good.
Please yell if I do something. All information about her life and miracles goes back to the monk Rudolf of Fulda, whom Rabanus Maurus, his abbot, charged with the task. He was still able to interview some people who had known the saint, especially her disciples Agatha, Thekla, Nana, and Lioba. In addition, he had sloppy notes, which had been made by another monk, Mano, who had been a spiritual friend of those women and who had often heard them talk about her. Mano's early death hindered his working through those notes, and Rudolf could then try to decipher them. So, in addition, Rudolf's Vita is available only, unfortunately, in later copies. But this is what he reports. Let's see. Lioba was born at the beginning of the 8th century into a pious noble family in Wessex. Her mother, Ebba, was a relative of Saint Boniface. She belonged to the second-generation Anglo-Saxon Christians. The parents being kind of skinny, as Rudolf reports, the married had long remained childless. Both parents prayed fervently to God until eventually both had become gray and old, having lost all hope in progeny. But their prayers had not gone unnoticed. Ebba, now I'm going back, dreamt of a church bell, and you see, can you see my cursor? You see this bell on the book of Lioba's icon. So the mother dreamt of a bell in her bosom, which then she pulled out with outstretched hands, started ringing, and kept ringing. The mother called for her own old wet nurse, who interpreted the dream. You will give birth to a daughter, whom you must devote to God already now. Just like Anna with Samuel, Ebba must let that child be trained in all holy knowledge and offered for monastic life. When the mother had made the promise, she indeed gave birth to a girl and called her first Trudgeba with a nickname Lioba, because from her earliest youth she was beloved by all. The wet nurse, meanwhile, received the gift of freedom. Now, once grown up, Leona was entrusted to Abbess Tetta in Winburn Monastery. Now, this place had been founded by Saint Cuthburga, whom you might know, and who was famous. The place was famous for its high educational standard, and in fact, Saint Cuthburga herself had accompanied Saint Boniface on some of his early missionary travels in southern Germany. Lioba received an extensive education. She devoted all her heart and mind to the heavenly teachings. She kept apart from the other girls, for whom the convent served as a kind of high-profile boarding school, and early cultivated her own asceticism and diligence in handiwork. The amazing thing for a worldly woman like me is that her focus on perfection did not awaken any hostile jealousy among her peers, but on the contrary, genuine love and admiration. Perhaps the explanation was that Lioba, in her fervent focus on Christ, was free of any personal vanity. Even more, she was, as Rudolf explains, intent on learning from everybody and on obeying everybody. That is, she must have known the secret of discovering in others the hidden sparks of their own holiness. By attending to these sparks, she helped her co-sisters to develop those sparks in themselves, and therefore also into a love for the saint who helped them to sanctify themselves. This is a hypothesis, but I think, and I want to interrupt for a moment because this is one of the personal relationships I have with Lioba. This reminds me of an ambition I myself have long been pursuing. How do we spot hidden saints that may populate our own neighborhood? Usually people are recognized as saints and venerated as such only after they have died, and then the tales about their lives and actions become streamlined towards the goal of their veneration. It is assumed that the audience must be brought to attend to the holy side of those persons exclusively. Now, of course, this doesn't work with everybody. I mean, if we think of Saint Constantine, equal to the apostles, he was not even his biographers could hide the emperor's atrocities. So emphasis had to be placed on his eventual repentance, and also his decision very late at the end of his life to be baptized, and also, of course, to the divine grace that had allowed him to build up a Christian empire for at least 1 millennium. Even since Boniface, after all, was not venerated in Germany as a universally accepted saint up to the 19th century, and then for the wrong reasons, namely for political reasons. And even his martyrdom was sometimes questioned since it came from the hands of robbers rather than from the enemies of the faith. I mean, they were also enemies, but primarily they were robbers interested in getting money. Still, we finally have learned to love and venerate St. Boniface everywhere today. Now, coming back to the challenge of spotting holiness among one's personal friends or family, which is much more difficult. In some cases, I'm even sure of having discovered some. Would I not hate myself for having remained blind in this regard to miss a hidden saint right next to me just because of some irrelevant character flaws covering the gold? I'm firmly convinced that we must train ourselves in this regard. This is why I find it helpful to attend to little flaws or little weaknesses, even in those whom the Church has already recognized as holy. I think this helps us looking also among our contemporaries through the paraphernalia. Let me give an example of Lioba. Rudolph records her dream of a crimson thread. Wait a minute. There it is, coming out of her mouth. When she pulled it with her hand, it became longer and longer, just as though it came from the interior of her entrails. Her hand, gathering the thread, filled ever more, and yet the thread still kept running. So she decided to turn it into a ball of wool, which became larger and larger as she desperately tried to finish. Caught by fear, she awakened. Now, wishing to learn the meaning of this significant dream, she remembers a sister who was gifted with a spirit of prophecy. But being too humble to approach that sister herself, Lioba resorted to an odd strategy. She asked one of her own pupils, because in the meantime she had become a teacher herself, to tell the details of that dream to that prophetic sister, pretending it had happened to herself, and ask for the meaning. Now really, modesty here and modesty there. Lioba, in fact, placed the young girl into the most embarrassing situation. Given the prophetic spirit of the older sister, could Lioba not have foreseen that her strategy would be uncovered and the girl charged with having lied, which is what Rudolph recounts? Because this is exactly what happened. And one wonders why that same prophetic spirit should not have revealed the girl's innocence, since she had acted under orders. She was simply getting used by Lioba, who at that moment was concerned only with maintaining her own humility. This incident has always bothered me, but in the meantime I always find it helpful. A fervent soul that tries to keep clear of all temptation may sometimes step on the feet of those around her. And you can become a saint even if you commit such pious recklessness. With Lioba, as I see it, failure in this one incident, I'm encouraged to continue recognizing sainthood in pious people who may likewise step on others' feet every now and then. Now back to Lioba. Preparation for her missionary work. The ball of wool and the prophecy, what did it mean? It meant Lioba, as the beloved of God himself, will excel in holiness and wisdom. She will be of use to many through her sermons and the model of her good works. The thread coming out of her mouth is her teaching of wisdom, a teaching that proceeds from her heart. Its filling her hand means that what she teaches, she also practices. The ball, she wound, indicates through its lightness and movability an ever-continued movement, both on earth, through works of love in daily life, and her upwards turn of mind during contemplation. And all of this will happen among other peoples, where she must travel. Now, it is impressive here, I think, to see that combination of callings of Martha and Maria from the New Testament, or of Leah and Rachel from the Old. I've always been uncomfortable with the separation of both callings. To be sure, the side-by-side existence of monastic and world Christianity is an indispensable tribute to human limitations, because most of us can attend only to one priority. Still, it is important in either setting to attempt as far as possible to combine both. I know that there have been great struggles about the extent to which contemplative monasteries are also called to offer charity. Think of the difference between Saints Neil Zorski and Joseph of Wolokalamsk. I mean, both these saints appreciated each other's works, but among those who were their visitors, there were struggles about what would be the superior way. And the beauty with Lioba and her whole way of living and teaching is an encouraging model of combining both. Now, during that same time that Lioba was in school and already teaching, St. Boniface had been consecrated missionary bishop for all of Germany by Pope Gregory of Rome. Trying to win the necessary co-workers, he sent many letters to the abbots and abbesses back home who knew him well and gladly supported his work. Earlier than that, Lioba had already addressed letters to him, reminding him of the familial relations and asking him, that child had nerves, for grammatical and style corrections of a Latin poem she had composed. And yes, the busy bishop complied. Boniface recognized the need to supplement the missionary work of monks with that of nuns. After all, only if the mothers in newly converted families could be fortified and trained in the faith would the long-term success of the conversion be secured. A fact actually to be considered today. The human rights-based and economically motivated emphasis on mothers working outside the house abandons children to secular care institutions. The time during which pious mothers can form their children is severely diminished. Abbess Teta, of course, did not like the sunshine of her convent leave, but she understood God's will, as expressed in that dream, and that it had to be obeyed. Lioba, together with the nuns Sinehild, Walburga, and her cousin Tekla, ventured on the long journey. The long journey is actually this, from Winburn Monastery to the Rhön. This one is a card showing St. Boniface's work, coming from here and then first working among the Frisians. And this is the area where he spent his first years with his first missionary work. So here we have. Boniface, after having charged his disciple Sturmi with building a monastery at Fulda. Now this, of course, is a later engraving. One sees here the beginning of the construction of the monastery, and one sees here a hill, which will be later important because Boniface often visited his monastery to take care of his monks there. But then he also withdrew into a cell on a little hill beside Fulda, which was later called the Bishop's Hill, later became the Frauenberg with a Franciscan monastery today on it, where he prayed and where he also met with Lioba on frequent visits. I'll speak more of that. Now, the place where she was put, just a second, at the head of a number of virgins who had already assembled in order to follow the monastic life, was Bischofsheim in the Rhön. Now, usually you will find St. Lioba associated with a different town, Tauberbischofsheim. But a local historian called Friedrich Stein has, I think, conclusively already shown that it must be Bischofsheim in the Rhön. The Rhön is a mountainous area much closer to Fulda. You see here, regardless of which walk Lioba would take, either she would have to walk 7 hours or 8 hours, depending on which route she chose. That was doable, maybe in 1, maybe in 2 days. But Tauberbischofsheim was located at a much greater distance, and it would have meant 28 hours. Among the reasons why I think we should really talk of Lioba of Bischofsheim and not of Tauberbischofsheim is, first of all, this geographical location, which is necessary to explain the possibility of meeting with Boniface regularly. And also after his death, she regularly came to pray at his grave. Other arguments, the recorded miracles of Saint Lioba include one that has to do with a river floating underneath her monastery. Now, in Bischofsheim, the place where her monastery stood has, in fact, a little river floating through it, whereas in Tauberbischofsheim, not only has no remains of the monastery ever been found where the monastery in Tauberbischofsheim was supposed to stand, but there was also no river. Stein explains that the idea with Tauberbischofsheim came through a later emendation of a manuscript. And then the Jesuits in Tauberbischofsheim seized upon the opportunity to have a very important local saint and started a great veneration in Tauberbischofsheim. And strangely enough, in Bischofsheim itself, even though people know of the monastery, they don't venerate her. This is very strange. At any rate, I want to show, this is the Renaissance building, which is today, which was a rent house, which is built on top of where the monastery formerly was in Bischofsheim. No, wait just a second. Yes, here we are. Now, as abbess and teacher, Saint Lioba so successfully trained her nuns in divine wisdom that several of them later became teachers on their own. All female monasteries in Germany asked for teachers from Lioba's school. She also founded convents in Kitzing and Ochsenfurt, along with many others, and supplied them with abbesses from the store of her disciples. Unfortunately, most of those foundations later disappeared. As abbess, Lioba emulated, let me see. Yes, this is she with Walburga and Tekla, who were connected with her through Boniface having imported, or even those from Great Britain. Oh no, this is still too early. So, as abbess, Lioba emulated what she had seen in her own monastic training back home, namely, never asking anything she did not fulfill herself, never playing the mistress, giving to each of her disciples the same kindness, love, and forbearance, looking like an angel, She had a pleasant way of talking, a clear focus on essentials, untiring energy, cheerfulness, and the ability to rightly assess her options. Thus, she was cautious never to undertake any task without making sure she could complete it. That I find especially admirable. But she also modified Theta's regimen along with its link with the Benedictine rule in important ways. First, just like Theta, she applied the strictest asceticism to herself. Her drinking mug was so tiny that the sisters called it the little one of the beloved. Yes, yet she made sure that all the others were fed with great liberality. Then, she was an incessant reader of holy books in order to complete her theological expertise, yet she insisted on both her nuns and herself taking a nap after lunch so as to refresh their ability to concentrate. And her constant attendance to scripture, patristic commentaries, and canons, all of which she had sisters read to her, even during her own night's sleep, enabled her, even while fast asleep, to spot and correct any error in pronunciation or content. The girls often jokingly tested her on that, but she always caught them. Now, let me tell you a little story. This ability to stay awake to holy things even while biologically fast asleep reminds me of my daughter's experience with our spiritual father, Father Vasilius of the Spiridon Skeet in Gaina. In his old age, he used to doze off during confession, sitting in a stuffy little cabinet in church in his armchair with us penitents on our knees before him, on a nice little rug though, and the vigil running on in the church behind the curtain. When such falling asleep happened during my own confession, I usually waited for him to come back, and my very silence would quickly awaken him. Yet my dear daughter once, when she saw his lids dropping and his breath deepening, thought, aha, now is the time to confess a particularly embarrassing sin. Maybe I can get away with it and get my absolution anyway. But as soon as she had started on it with a jerk, Father was wide awake and her little ruse came to naught. Nevertheless, coming back to Lioba, she was careful not to overstep the limits of what she herself and her sisters could bear. Both in view of waking and in view of the other virtues she observed and imposed, she maintained consistently a sensible measure. This down-to-earthness practiced by our saint has become a warning to me, if I may be allowed to add a personal regard again. When I encountered Orthodoxy in my 50th year, I allowed myself to be totally absorbed by this incredible new discovery and made a headlong dive into all aspects of what I had read about holiness and church life. I totally forgot about and profoundly shocked my dear family, who could no longer recognize the person they had known and whose changes were not consistently for the better to boot. It took years to heal the damage my over-enthusiasm inflicted on family life. Back to Lioba, the same spirit of sensible self-control also permeated her unlimited practice of hospitality. Whoever came to the monastery's door was fed and clothed. Rudolf here reports that she herself, apart from offering the holy service of washing her guests' dirty feet, kneeling before them like a slave, also insisted on cooking their food by herself. She must have wanted to spare the sisters in charge of cooking for the community the additional work feeding those many hungry visitors would have imposed. Now we get to Lioba's fame all over Germany. Let's see. Her leadership established Lioba's great renown all over the German lands. Bishops and princes, even King Pippin and later Charlemagne, invited her to their palaces. Here they discussed theological questions with a highly educated and wise woman and asked her advice in church and policy matters. Her guidance was sought everywhere, and though she herself never liked court luxury and always hurried back to her simple monastic life. Hildegard, wait a minute, here she is. Charlemagne's second wife positively loved her as a spiritual mother. This poor child had been married at the age of 13 and would die with 25 after having given birth to 9 children, several of whom died in early youth. Understandably, this exhausted queen clung to a loving mother. When later St. Lioba had retired to Schornstein, her retiring place in old age, Hildegard, probably pregnant again and having only 1 more year to live, called her urgently to the court in Aachen. The travel distance was so much less, she argued, and she wanted to make sure of a final meeting before her aunt's surmise, before her beloved saints falling asleep. But Lioba, going there, even though it was very difficult for her in her old age, as soon as she realized that there was no urgent spiritual need, but only an emotional desire, immediately turned back home, after a loving farewell, to be sure. With somewhat frightful harshness, she encouraged no sentimentality. But then she was also close to her own death. And perhaps it was that rigorous emotional self-control which had been the very condition under which Saint Boniface had been able to allow for so much personal and heartfelt closeness with this spiritual daughter. It seems to me that this aspect of her personality contains an important warning, especially for women and even more so for women in the world. In our sex's deep-seated desire to love and be loved, we must struggle for that amount of hardness which allows us to put not our feelings, but Christ in the first place. Given Lioba's renown, it is no wonder that many of the local lords entrusted their daughters and wives for training in the faith and for general education to her. They recognized a well-cultivated wife and daughter to be an asset for their own homes and that of future grandchildren. And just as many of those noble women, especially widows, decided to take the veil under Lioba's guidance, so did many girls and women from the neighboring farms. All of this created a fruitful living together between church and nobility in the whole Main-Frankish region. Now we get to the miracles. It's very interesting. Boniface, the difficulty of venerating Boniface was partially due to the fact that there are no recorded miracles. I mean, miracles did happen when he was dead and when his relics were carried along from Mainz to Fulda. Then yes, and then there was the one miracle when he felled the Donas oak, and which was a heathen sanctuary. And that was felled and nothing happened. And there is the idea that the oak split itself into boards from which he built a church. Okay. But beyond that, Boniface had no miracle. There are many miracles by Lioba, but only some have been recorded. Most of the guests of the monastery, to be sure, to be grateful and pious, but some turned out to be real threats to the monastery's existence. Thus, one woman who had lived outside the monastery walls for a long time and had been clothed and fed by Lioba consistently also led an unruly life. Embarrassed by the birth of an unwanted child, she threw it into the river that passed through the monastery. The next day, a woman from the village in the neighborhood was doing her washing in that river and saw, coming out from under the monastery walls, the little corpse. Assuming a serious lack of discipline among the nuns, she created a scandal in the whole neighborhood. The matter was brought before Lioba, and she proceeded to form a procession around the church asking for divine help in this terrible trial. I mean, she didn't do anything like researching or looking around and trying to find the reason and all that. She turned to prayer. 2 times already the nuns had carried the altar's cross around the church singing and praying. And then Lioba turned to that cross a 3rd time and with great emphasis cried for relief. At that moment, all of a sudden, the nuns notice a noise in the back of the church. That woman, who was guilty, found herself subjected to some higher force and, loudly crying and weeping, publicly confessed her own sin. Now, this was the first miracle which made Lioba famous, even in distant regions. 2 further miracles confirmed her sanctity and public renown. In one case, the straw coverings over the monastic buildings had caught fire. People came screaming to the abbess. Even the neighboring settlement was in danger from flight of sparks. Lioba very calmly asked a sister to bring some water from the little river. When she received the bucket, she added some salt St. Boniface had blessed and told them to throw that salt water into the crook used for quenching the fire. And the fire, duly respecting the great missionary's blessing, at once subsided. In another case, the area was harassed by a terrible thunderstorm that threatened to even unsettle the monastery's walls. The nuns were praying in church, and the farmers with their families had all come in for protection, even though also worried about the stability of the church. After much praying and urged by the terrified people, Lioba went to the church doors, opened them wide, stood there all alone in the midst of thunder and lightning, and then she made a loud entreaty for help to the Holy Theotokos. And at once the storm subsided. A 4th miracle has been doubted by some because it appears only in later manuscripts. But I see no reason to doubt it, especially since it involves a local family and a nun whose name was generally known. Here goes. Nun Williswind was very ill and on her way to dying. Her parents came and asked the abbess for permission to carry her home, thus giving the family the consolation of final caretaking. So Williswind was carried to her home farm. When death was imminent, the family came to ask for Lioba's prayers. But she accompanied them and found her non-motionless and already covered by a cloth. She asked the cloth to be removed and announced, "Your daughter is still alive." Then she sent to her monastery someone should bring milk and her own spoon. With a spoon, she then dripped little drops of that milk into Williswind's mouth. The nun recovered and spent many more years at the monastery. Now I come to later trials. Are you still with me, or I'm talking too long?
We're still with you, dear Cornelia. All is good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. In spite of all those educational and charitable achievements, and in spite of her recognition as a well-received partner in theological and political discussions, and in spite of her miracles, but perhaps also because of the extensive hospitality she practiced, the monastery was economically underprovided. Even until today, Monasteries for men receive greater donations than those for women. It's a fact. In the Middle Ages and onwards, this mismatch proceeded from the political role only male monasteries could play in strengthening rulers' grasps on a region and training the government elite. Lioba's request for help to Bishop Lullus of Mainz was answered by orders from Saint Boniface. It encouraged patience, and Saint Lioba obeyed, never losing her courageous cheerfulness. Still, especially after Saint Boniface's martyrdom, her settlement lacked sources of income. The Fulda monks had their own Frankish notions about the role of women. In their concern about keeping the sexes apart and the females down, they had not been amused at Saint Boniface's departure meeting, with him placing his own riasa on Lioba and encouraging her continued mission, entrusting her to the charge and protection of his monks, and insisting on her privilege, should he die and be buried in his monastery, to access his grave whenever she wanted. They had never understood. This is a later view of the church in Fulda, in the monastery. It's about 1,000, but it was the only one I could find. They had never understood the deep and respectful friendship which their famous bishop had cultivated with a niece he had recognized as a real great saint. 16, yes. After Saint Boniface's first burial in his monastery, church in Fulda, Lioba continued her regular visits to pray at that grave. Once again, that unique privilege was granted without much kindly welcome. Traveling with several of her sisters, she had to leave them in a separate cell at some distance, because she was the only woman whom Saint Boniface had charged his monks with admitting to his grave. 17. Towards the ends of her life, Saint Lioba retreated to Schornsheim, a place close to Mainz, where Lullus was bishop. Lullus was also a disciple of Saint Boniface. Charlemagne had given her a farm with a church. The reason for this withdrawal has never been clarified. Was she really in need of rest? But why so far from her continental home? Did she want to make room for a successor? Did the quarrel between Abbot Sturmius of Fulda and Bishop Lullus play a role? Lullus wanted Fulda to be included in his own diocese, that is, to get the donations which Fulda attracted distributed to his diocese. Whereas Sturmius insisted on staffopedial, as we would call it, independence, directly under the Pope, which he eventually managed. Or did the Fulda monks want to get rid of a woman with great authority and celebrity among the hierarchy, and who would never renounce her privilege of praying at her spiritual father's grave? Some of these assumptions seem corroborated by the disproportionately great emphasis Rudolf, her biographer, placed on separation of monks from nuns. He describes in great detail that the convent Lioba was sent to as a young girl was situated alongside with a monastery for men, but that never ever, since the foundation of both, had any woman been allowed to visit the latter, and any man, except the priest who had to do liturgy, and I don't know if he got even a sort of refreshment afterwards, had to leave the place, even immediately afterwards, to place a foot into the former. And that rule applied even for bishops. Even more. Pardon? Okay. Even more, Rudolf explains that the abbess of the Winborn convent, even though in the time of Lioba's stay there, she was a sister of the king, of the local king, she would settle monastic business by speaking through a window, with visitors and guests remaining outside. It must have been such a spirit that the Fulda monks had offered, because of which the Fulda monks had offered Lioba only a grumbling hospitality in her own visit. Lioba herself, encouraged by Saint Boniface, had never done window business herself, but instead freely followed invitations and enjoyed honorable popularity and welcome. Similar evidence for this amount of aversion to women is presented by the fact that Willibald, the biographer of Saint Boniface, in spite of his own English education, totally cancelled Lioba from his vita. Probably he was ordered to do so. Now, the same Fulda resentment later surfaced after Lioba's falling asleep. The monks there resolutely disregarded Saint Boniface's final wish that she be buried alongside with him and even in his own grave, so that they would be united while waiting for the resurrection in Christ. Instead, her relics presented some embarrassment. They were first placed alongside his grave in a separate place within the monastery church, but the great numbers of female pilgrims rendered that solution unfeasible. Especially women from the ruling families among her venerators exerted pressure, so that the next abbot, Rabanus Maurus, had her transported to a newly founded convent called St. Peter on Petersberg in 836. Here her remains were kept along with many other relics of holy virgin martyrs accessible for female veneration. And after some back and forth, due to the peasant wars in the 16th century, here her relics can be venerated still today. You have to go into the crypt, and there are very nice Benedictine sisters, Lioba sisters, who love the Orthodox who come from the Hermitage and come from all over Germany to venerate. And they always open for us this door. And back here, can you see my cursor? Yeah? Okay. Back here is a very beautiful reliquary of her head. And back there is the original coffin where she was laid, a stone coffin. The stone coffin is empty now, but in the olden days, many Catholic mothers would go there and place the clothes for their little children in there to have them sanctified and protected. And so what one doesn't see very well here, these are very old frescoes, very beautiful, non-restored, still original frescoes. And so we often are here and sing and pray to Saint Lioba. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, dear Cornelia. It was very interesting and very informative. And we learned about Saint Lioba, who came from our land and who was a great missionary in Germany and who was at the beginning of the baptizing German people, and who was an educator, a diplomat, who was a very wise woman and at the same time very pious and very humble woman. Thank you very much. It was really very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for allowing me to talk about her. Father, please bless.
Yeah. Just wonder if someone wants to ask a question.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
So if I may, I will ask just my only question. Where did you find all this information about Saint Lioba? Are there any libraries, archives, or how did you gather all the information?
I'm not on that level. I am a lay person who uses things that are easily accessible. Now, luckily, the wonderful internet has editions of later prints of Rudolf's original Vita, which doesn't contain everything. Some chapters are strangely left out. And there are various sources which I just, from books and from internet sources, so I just collected these together. And since I have been talking about her at various occasions, somehow it grew, her relevance and her interest and her closeness has just grown. But the data are generally available. Everybody can find them. And I didn't invent anything. For example, even this question about how, why were the monks of Fulda so not really helpful to this wonderful saint? I mean, that is something that has been discussed in the literature. And I observed then that really it's very odd how much emphasis Rudolf placed on this business of keeping monks and nuns separate. Now, of course, we all know that Saint Boniface, when he came to these regions where Lioba's monastery was, he encountered the leftovers of a Christianity that had been brought there first by Kilian and his disciples, and that had kind of that had deteriorated, especially with respect to, I mean, the very contested question of married priests, because the Irish who had come there had understood correctly that priests can have wives. I mean, each priest one wife, of course. But Boniface was very already influenced by the Roman view that this was impossible. So he criticized very severely what he saw as a moral deterioration, and maybe, you know, that very strong emphasis on sexual purity had to do with this hostility.
Okay. Okay, interesting.
What monastic rule they use in the monastery of Saint Lioba? Do you know
Excuse me.
about? Do you know about the which monastic rule?
It was, yeah, I mean, it was a modified Benedictine rule. Actually, I mean, most of Boniface had Saint Boniface had some of his disciples sent to, where is it, in Rome, in Italy, where Saint Benedict had lived. I mean, Castel Gandolfo was certainly a model monastery. So he did, when he built his monastery in Fulda, he made sure that the Benedictine rule was observed. But the fascinating thing about Lioba, who also was raised in this tradition, was that she modified it. Even, I mean, already the Benedictine rule is a modification of much more severe rules that were implemented in southern France and brought to Ireland. So the ora et labora principle was much more humane in a way than many of the more austere rules earlier. But Lioba modified this so that it was livable for the women under her care.
Okay.
Thank
We
you.
have a question. Father Michael, go ahead. We have a question from the request, Cornelia. One of our guests missed the story about the saint's dream, about Saint Lioba's dream. Can you summarize it once again in few words, please?
She missed which?
The Saint Lioba's dream.
Jean?
Dream.
Rim? Help.
Can you open the chat?
Yes?
There is a last comment in the chat.
A chat. I don't know. I don't see a chat.
Okay. So then, can you repeat the story about what Saint Lioba have seen in her dream?
Had seen in?
In her dream.
Ah, thank you. You know, I mean, I'm going to get hearing aids next month. I'm old and have difficulty. So what she had seen in her dream. Ah, yes. Just hold it. There will be the picture. Here it is. She had seen a red thread of wool coming out of her mouth, and more and more and more and more. And she tried to gather it in her hands, and it became more and more and more. And then she decided, with all this thread, she had to kind of pull it around to make a kind of a ball of wool. And the ball got bigger and bigger. And she got scared because it was all so strange. And then she woke up, and that is the dream she had.
Yes. And what was the meaning of this dream?
Okay. The meaning of the dream, it is quite funny. It reminds me of allegorical Bible interpretation, okay? This old sister who had a prophetic spirit said, the string of wool that comes out of your mouth is really your holy teaching. And that teaching comes right from your heart. And that teaching, the fact that you have to hold all these strings in your hand, symbolizes the fact that what you teach, you also do with your hands, that is, your works, will realize or correspond to what you teach. And then the ball is round and can move very easily up and down. And it is the liveliness with which you will serve others. On the one hand, when it moved down on the earth, down to earth service, so to speak, but it also can go up. And when you are in contemplation, your spirit approaches the Lord above in heaven. And so this was the whole package that was told her.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I have a question about the I guess the like Irish connection. I think before the session kind of officially started, you're talking about the Irish saints who went to continental Europe. As was the kind of the mission of Saint Boniface, were they was there like a cooperation there, or were they inspired by Irish saints who went, or just talk about that?
You are opening a very thorny subject. And, in a way, I would like to talk about that, but to prepare myself adequately, because it's very difficult for me, a non-historian, to evaluate the various voices I have heard about it or read, because quite obviously, the way in which the mission to the Anglo-Saxons happened through Augustine coming on the orders of, I think, Pope Gregory the Great, the way how the Irish were treated, encountered, forced into subjection, that is one version I have read, is very complex. And I must say, I am still trying to really understand, for example, what happened between St. Boniface and St. Willibrord. I cannot give a clear assessment. I only know that the traditions which were built up from people bringing Christianity to Ireland very early, who had come from Greece via southern France, who brought in traditions from the desert. And what grew up in Ireland was then very specific. And Ireland was a little bit cut off from the later development of the Roman hierarchy, and also from later developments in the calculation of Easter. And that turned out to be an absurd quarrel where the Irish were forced. So then there was also a special role of Wales. I must say, I'm talking here out of a huge amount of ignorance. I cannot say anything clear, but there was a difference in traditions. There was a certain arrogance in the Latin missionaries coming to Great Britain in the way how they encountered these incredibly pious Irish and tried to establish an overlordship that never was really part of Orthodoxy. So there were some sad things going on with monasteries being closed, with monastics fleeing away to Scotland or far away and so on. But I have not really understood yet how this affected the mission of St. Boniface, the mission of St. Willibrord, their relationship and so on. So I'm sorry, I'm unprepared on that one.
No worries. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So if you do not have any more questions, then yes, once again, I would like to thank you, Cornelia, for your time, for your interesting presentation, and I hope you will be able to visit Ireland one day.
I did. I already had some conferences there, but at that time, unfortunately, I think I was not yet Orthodox, so I missed a lot. And I'm afraid I'm too old now. My husband doesn't allow me to travel anymore because I'm such a mess when I write papers. And so I fear I will have to miss that and just be content with reading about it and loving every bit I read.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much, Cornelia. I noticed that you have a troparion.
Excuse me?
I noticed that you have troparion of Saint Lioba. Can you read it for us?
Yes. I have to run through it. How did you know?
Yeah, can you read it?
Yes. And now I can translate it. That probably makes more sense, right?
If you can, yes, please.
In thou, O Mother, the likeness was carefully preserved. You took the cross and you did follow Christ. Through your way of life, you taught not to take important fleshly things because they are perishable, but rather to focus on the soul, the unsterblich, undieable creation. In this way, your spirit rejoices with the angels, pious Lioba.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.